Dictator Putin ended 2025 without victories, and 2026 may be even harsher. According to the Wall Street Journal, Russia captured less than 1% of Ukrainian territory last year. At this pace, it would take Moscow another year just to reach the administrative border of Donbass, the very line Putin demands as a precondition for peace. At the same time, the United States is sending a clear message of strength. The swift seizure of Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro highlighted Russia's military weakness. Caracas was a key Kremlin ally, and the operation openly embarrassed Moscow. Russian analyst Abbas Gulamov called it a textbook example of how a real special military operation looks, one that further demoralized Russia's elites. Another blow followed soon after. The US seized an oil tanker escorted by the Russian Navy. The signal was unmistakable. Even Russia's perceived safe zones are no longer safe. Russia's finances are deteriorating fast. Military spending in 2025 reached 15 trillion rubles, 5 times higher than before the full-scale invasion. At the same time, oil and gas revenues fell by 34%. To cover the budget gap, Moscow raised VAT to 22%, pushing the cost of war onto ordinary Russians. Public opinion is shifting. Polling by the Levada Center shows that support for continuing the war dropped from 37% in late 2024 to 25% a year later. Two-thirds of Russians now want peace talks. Wall Street Journal's conclusion is blunt. Putin can suppress public disconnect, but he cannot sustain the war without elite support. If the US expands military aid to Ukraine, especially air and missiles defense, pressure from within the Kremlin will grow. Russia is trying to shield its shadow oil fleet by reflagging tankers under the Russian tricolor, but the strategy appears to be failing. According to the Wall Street Journal, the United States has already seized 5 oil tankers linked to sanctions crude shipments. In recent weeks alone, more than 15 vessels switched flags to Russia, apparently hoping US forces would hesitate to intercept ships flying Moscow's colors. The most telling case was tanker Bella 1. While being tracked across the Atlantic, the crew painted a Russian flag on the hull and claimed protection from Moscow. It didn't work. US Special Forces seized the vessel anyway, declaring it stateless due to false registration. The tanker was empty at the time. Shipping intelligence firms report that 25 tankers reflagged to Russia in late 2025. Maritime lawyers say the legality of such flag changes is highly questionable under international law. The seizure are now creating a new flashpoint between Washington and Moscow at sea. Russian naval vessels briefly escorted some tankers, but in the Bella 1 case, Russia pulled back to avoid escalation. The broader shift is clear. The shadow fleet is no longer being quietly tolerated. Western enforcement has moved from paperwork to physical interdiction, putting real pressure on Russia's oil revenues and on the system that helps finance the war. Iran is going through a profound shock. Anti-government protests have claimed the lives of hundreds of people. Thousands have been detained, and the internet has been shut down. Authorities are brutally suppressing public demonstrations across the country. According to human rights groups, the death toll has exceeded 500, while more than 10,000 people have been detained over the past 2 weeks. Iranian state television aired footage from a morgue, claiming that those killed were bystanders, including bank employees, street vendors, and people who were simply on their way to the supermarket. Activists, however, insist that the majority of those killed were protesters. Independent verification remains extremely difficult as internet access has been cut and phone lines are restricted. According to the human rights activist organization, 496 of the dead were protesters, while 48 were members of the security forces. What is happening behind the closed doors of Iranian morgues was described by a man who says he witnessed it himself.
Today I was at the forensic morgue. We saw bodies and spoke with families. People had simply gone out to buy groceries and never came back. One man went up to the roof of his building to see what was happening outside and was shot. I have never seen anything like this in my life.
US President Donald Trump is considering a range of potential military actions against Iran following a violent crackdown and anti-government protest. According to CNN, 2 US officials said Trump has been briefed in recent days on multiple intervention scenarios as unrest in Iran escalated into mass arrests and fatalities. The officials said the president is weighing whether to follow through on his recent warnings to strike the Iranian regime if it continues to use force against civilians. The developments suggest that the crisis in Iran is no longer just a domestic issue, but one that could quickly turn into a major international flashpoint. The idea of peace in Ukraine has never felt closer, yet an actual ceasefire remains out of reach. Writing for The Guardian, Gwendoline Sass, director of the Center of East European and International Studies, argues that diplomacy has intensified, high-level meetings have multiplied, but nothing essential has changed. Fighting continues, security guarantees remain unresolved, and Moscow shows no political will to end the war. Even the much-publicized talks in Paris, which brought together more than 30 countries in a so-called coalition of the willing, produced little more than a statement of intent. No real peace negotiations began. A ceasefire framework was not agreed. At the same time, Russia has moved in the opposite direction, stepping up attacks on Ukraine, particularly against energy infrastructure. Sasa describes this as a deliberate strategy to pressure civilians during winter, both physically and psychologically. Western governments continue to signal long-term support for Kyiv, from monitoring a future ceasefire to deeper defense cooperation. France and the UK again raised the possibility of troop deployments after hostilities stop. Germany, for the first time, cautiously opened the door to involvement, though under strict conditions, yet the central obstacle remains unchanged. The Kremlin is not in a hurry. Sasa argues that Dictator Putin believes time is on his side, encouraged by direct contacts with Donald Trump's transactional-minded administration. How the war in Ukraine ends, she concludes, will be a defining test, not only for peace efforts, but for a shifting global order where alliances are fluid and old rules no longer hold. Copenhagen says it is facing a fateful moment as tensions grow over US ambitions toward Greenland. Speaking at a political rally, Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen warned that the situation goes far beyond a territorial dispute and strikes at the core of Europe's security architecture. She signaled concern that threats against an ally by the United States would represent an unprecedented break inside the Western alliance, something that Europe has never faced before. Frederiksen said she has not discussed Greenland with Donald Trump since a phone call a year ago, but emphasized that Copenhagen is working to ensure its position is clearly understood in Washington and that this position remains firm and non-negotiable. Trump has repeatedly argued that the United States should control Greenland to prevent Russian and Chinese influence in the Arctic. The Danish leader responded by warning that any forced annexation of the island by the US would effectively undermine NATO itself.
Look, if we don't take Greenland, Russia or China will, and I'm not letting that happen. If we don't take Greenland, Russia or China will take Greenland, and I am not going to let that happen.
Is there any deal they can offer you?
Yeah, sure, I'd love to make a deal with them. It's easier. But one way or the other, we're going to have Greenland.
Pope calls for peace in Ukraine and the Middle East. During his Sunday prayer in the Vatican, Pope Leo XIV spoke about peace and an end to violence. He referred to the situation in the Middle East, particularly in Iran and Syria, where ongoing tensions are costing many lives. The Pope emphasized the importance of dialogue and a patient pursuit of peace for the common good. He also addressed the situation in Ukraine, saying that new and particularly serious attacks on energy infrastructure are hitting civilians hard, especially as cold weather worsen. The Pope said he is praying for all those who are suffering and renewed his call to end the violence and intensify efforts to achieve peace.
In Ukraine, new and particularly serious attacks, mainly targeting energy infrastructure, are hitting the civilian population hard, just as the cold weather is getting worse. I pray for those who are suffering and renew my appeal for an end to violence and for efforts to achieve peace to be intensified.
Winter has tightened its grip across much of Europe. Heavily snowfall and freezing temperature have caused travel problems in several countries. The Alps were among the hardest hit. Blocked roads forced hundreds of tourists to spend the night in sport holes. People were giving temporary shelter until conditions improved. By morning, snow lofts cleared the roads and traffic slowly resumed. Many travelers were able to continue their journeys, and ski resorts are gradually returning to normal. Not everyone was able to move right away. Some passengers spent part of the night stuck on a bus on a mountain road, waiting for the weather to ease. Even though conditions have improved, authorities are still warning people to be careful in the mountains. With so much fresh snow, the avalanche risk remains very high. Experts say even one skier can trigger a deadly slide. There have been fatalities. The bad weather hasn't stopped at the mountains. Snow and cold have disrupted transport elsewhere in Europe too, with delays, cancellations and difficult road conditions. And the cold spell is not over yet. Thank you for watching, and for more content, please subscribe.